This is Brian, ScreenFiles.com and Review. And what I'm looking at today is 2025's The Eternaut, which is based on an Argentinian comic. Like I said in my reaction, The Eternaut is an alien invasion story. And while that is not stated until probably, I want to say, the third episode, there are all sorts of hints dropped that something beyond the norm is happening. For instance, and they see in the sky over Argentina, Aurora Borealis, which as far as I'm aware is not a normal thing for Argentina. And then throughout the first two episodes you see meteorites falling on occasion. Now, once again, the movie doesn't tell you what they are, but based upon how odd things get, it's safe to assume that an alien invasion is happening. It's worth mentioning that when we do see these aliens, they look vaguely similar to the bugs, or some of the bugs I should say, from Starship Troopers, the Paul Verhoeven movie. And that's not an accident from what I've heard, because one of my readers from Argentina themselves have said that Starship Troopers, at least in the depiction of the bugs, was inspired by The Eternaut, which, as I mentioned, was a comic. And so that's plausible to me. The Eternaut was published between 1957 and numerous to its lore after that time. So it's not at all surprised that the creators of Starship Troopers used elements as inspiration. Originally, The Eternaut was published between 1957 and 1959 and was written by Hector Herman Osterheld and illustrated by Franco Scalero Lopez. One of the things that makes The Eternaut, by my reckoning, so interesting is that their perspective is entirely Argentinian. Most movies that the average person sees in the United States come from the United States. There are movie industries all over the world, from Africa to Europe. They're producing movies for a particular audience. And in that respect, The Eternaut is no different. It is entirely an Argentinian series based upon Argentinian subject matter. And therefore, the approach to the material is not at all the same as you would see from an American production. And as I've said before, this is why I really like Netflix. They invest heavily in international productions. What they produce can't help but to have perspectives and views that are different from what we traditionally see. As I said, The Eternaut is quite different from what something produced in the United States would yield. For instance, we've seen movies like Independence Day and many other alien invasion films. We know how it's going to go. Namely, the United States or an American will be triumphant over whatever. That is initially very interesting, but it becomes also very predictable, because no matter what the scenario is, you know how it's going to go. And they typically illustrate American landmarks, be it the Statue of Liberty or some other place in the United States. And that's a way to disseminate culture. This is a way that culture, American culture in particular, is disseminated. And it undervalues cultures from other places. The Eternaut, as I mentioned earlier, avoids this by being distinctly Argentinian. And this also reflects the situation that the characters in the series has to deal with, in that when things first start, there's lots of chaos in terms of protest. A group of people who are friends who come together to play cards are doing so when it starts to snow. This is happening in Argentina. I'm not familiar with the weather in that country, so I get the feeling it doesn't snow often. And in any case, they come to notice that outside their window, they're hearing car crashes and all sorts of noises. And they eventually come to realize that this snow kills. This is the beginning of the invasion, and it's atypical because, as I mentioned earlier, you don't see aliens. You do have snow that kills them. So for the bulk of the first 2 episodes, this group of people are trying to survive this bizarre situation, as well as to find others of their family that just weren't with them at the time. The 3rd episode is where we're introduced to the aliens, and where comparisons between Starship Troopers would most likely be made. A curious thing, though, about the Eternaut is that there are no real heroes per se, in the sense that everyone is working towards a common goal. Everyone in this friends group tries to help in whatever way they can. Some help more than others. That being said, it's an ensemble cast, but characters don't weigh typically much heavier than other characters. And this is a really interesting and curious aspect, this way of approaching things that involves more than one individual. The movie never becomes John McClane-ified. And if you're not aware who John McClane is, he is the character played by Bruce Willis in Die Hard. And other people were in that movie, to be sure, but that movie was John McClane's movie. The Eternaut, by comparison, involves other people, and some people's roles are more dominant than others. But an important message that I think the series is trying to get across is that no one can go it alone. So everyone contributes to the common welfare. That being said, if there were one person who was more forward in terms of leadership, that would be Salvo, played by Ricardo Darín. And he very much uses his military training, because he fought in the Falklands War with Great Britain, to the benefit of the group. But once again, other people have other talents as well. And the only reason I would say that he's a bit of a leader is that characters go on side quests, if you will, try to find relatives that weren't with them when the snow started. And so Salvo and his wife are trying to find their daughter, who was visiting friends before the incident happened. It's worth mentioning that, personally, I found the first episode of The Eternaut somewhat difficult to get into. It's establishing character, but that takes time, and it does use that time to its benefit, and it really pays off as the series progresses. While I wouldn't call it slow, I would certainly say it's very leisurely. Now keep in mind, it's only 6 episodes, so that first episode very gradually lays out what's happening, and we are introduced to Salvo and his friends, as well as their spouses and so on. Though admittedly that was a bit hard for me. I actually started it, stopped it, and went back to it. And once I got beyond the first episode, then things really began to flow, and it became much more interesting because, as I said, it approaches the alien invasion thriller in a much more innovative manner than you're likely to see. Though it does take its time getting there. The first episode, as I said, I thought was a little leisurely. Things start to pick up with the second and really shift into gear with the third. Though, what's interesting about that is that it's not the most interesting thing about the story, which is kind of funny when you think about it. You're waiting for things to become more familiar, and they do. By my reckoning, the most interesting things happen in the 5th and 6th episodes, where the alien invasion seems to be, I don't know if pushed back is the right word, but certainly under control, where people, along with the remnants of the army, begin to mobilize in a counteroffensive. And this, to me, is where things get really interesting, because the story takes a turn that you're not going to expect, more than likely. And it's really clever. I don't want to hint at what it was, because I think you need to just see it for yourself. But it's really well done, it's kind of neat. And what I really enjoyed about this twist is that it's not foisted upon you. The story lays out clues, like with the alien invasion. This change in the status quo is laid out prior. You see hints of it, though they're only realized in the 6th episode. Overall, I really enjoyed the Eternaut. While starting a bit leisurely, you'll notice that I am deliberately not using the word slow, because that has negative connotations. Though it is, as I said, fairly leisurely. Things build up in a real satisfying and interesting manner. Though what's best of all is that it's telling a familiar story in an unfamiliar way. If you've seen other alien invasion movies, you have not seen one quite like the Eternaut. And by the way, I should mention that it has been renewed for a second and I believe final season on Netflix. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com, and if you agree, disagree, let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like, follow, or buy me a coffee.